Good morning. Welcome to our class together. Today we are finishing our series on Christ in the shadow of the Old Testament. We're going to look at the book of Hebrews today. It's a book that confuses us, but it's only for a reason. And hopefully by the end of the day, you can see it has a richness to it as far as the prophecies of Christ that make a lot of difference. But let's start this way. Have you ever seen footprints on the ground? In front of our house, they had poured a new sidewalk section several years ago. And I remember it was late in the day when they finally got it all finished, and the cement was still wet as the workers drove off and night began to fall. Somewhere along the time, while the concrete was still impressionable, a raccoon walked through it and it left its prints to harden. So every time I walk on that sidewalk, I see the remnants of the raccoon that was there that day. I don't know what the raccoon looked like, but I do know he left his prints there, so I know that's what it is. That's the same principle that we're going to look at today, a principle of real and copy, something called type and antitype. But before we dive into that, I wanted to take a generic look at the book of Hebrews and really what we've been doing through this whole series. I think there's an important question to ask, and the question is why? Why in the world does God use prophecy to tell us about Christ? Why doesn't He just tell us what it is? Why do the gospel writers feel the need to point backward to the prophecies of the Old Testament to connect Jesus with that? Why is it that in Genesis chapter 3, when sin enters the world, God didn't say, look, one of these days, I'm going to send my own son, and he is going to die on a cross. He's going to wash away your sins, and we're going to get back to the way it was before this dirty thing happened in the Garden of Eden. I think it's pretty apparent why. That sounds like a fantastical story, one that is unbelievable on many ways. We need something. The reason God doesn't do it the way we think He should have, perhaps, is because He knows you and I too well. Because you see, we don't want someone to tell us, we need to discover it. When I was a boy, I had an experience. Now, you could have read about this experience in any science textbook. It would describe the process of a caterpillar weaving a chrysalis, going into that chrysalis, and emerging as a butterfly. I could have read that, understood it in some way, and moved on. But there was nothing as magical as watching the chrysalis begin to shake a little bit and watching the butterfly to emerge. What you experience, what you discover, what I discovered, has held more power and more hold over me than anything I could have read about or had been lectured to about. We like to discover things. When we discover something, we go, look at what I found. Now, it could be that we do that on a regular basis, stuff that we could learn another way, but we enjoy the process of discovery. And the real reason is we really don't understand until we have understood. I know that sounds like a twisted type of a saying, but let me explain to you. Now, you can understand gravity. Gravity means that there is a pull of the earth to the center, and when something is above that, it's going to be pulled toward the earth with the gravity. You can understand that. It's very basic. And yet, you really understand it if you fall out of a tree. The experience lets you know this is a bad thing if you get in very high. And even though you have understood the principle, now you understand the dynamic of it. It's a different process. What God does is He understands that you and I are in great need of a bridge of understanding being built. A bridge of understanding is when something is known and it takes you across to the unknown. So when you use illustrations, for instance, it's something you know, but then you find the unknown. We see that in the rest of the Bible, for instance. When Jesus wants to explain why some people don't respond to the message and others do, this is the way he explains it. There was a sower who went out to sow seed. A simple story. Everybody knew what a sower did. Everybody knew what seed did. Everybody watched this process happening. It was something they knew quite well. But when Jesus tells a story, he enlivens it to the point he said, that's the reason people don't respond. Or when he wants to expose the bigotry of the self-righteous Pharisees against the publicans and the sinners, he talks about a man who has two sons, one who runs away, lives profitably, and then comes back and his father welcomes him. But there's an older son who, who wishes he was dead rather than alive. Do you understand forgiveness of God? And do you understand why we don't always see the same forgiveness? It's a simple story, but it takes the known from to the unknown. You now know because you have attached it to something you're aware of, something you know. And so when you come to the book of Hebrews has a very particular place in the New Testament. And one of the things it talks about are Hebrew Christians who over time are feeling the pressure of their faith, the anxiety, perhaps it is the constant movement of Gentiles into the church, perhaps it is the external pressure from the Roman government when they watch their Jewish brethren not be bothered. We're not exactly sure, but we do know this, that there is a desire to retreat to the known and the comfortable. When you're under pressure, we always want to do something that is normal. We want to go do something we've always done. We want to do something that will make us comfortable. That's why under times of high anxiety, we'll eat too much. See, one of the things that happened, for instance, during the COVID pandemic, I remember Vicki and I, we went to we ordered yeast of all things, something so common, so ordinary. You couldn't find yeast. You know why? Because everybody wanted to bake all of a sudden because that's what made them comfortable. That was a very normal activity, and it gave them something to eat that was quite regular. You retreat to the known and the comfortable under times of stress. When a college student is homesick and he's under this great stress, the antidote may be a weekend at home eating his mother's cooking and sleeping in his own bed. He's going to retreat to the known and the comfortable. The Hebrews were doing the same thing. We came out of this pattern that had all kinds of things that we knew quite well. We knew what the sacrificial schedule was. We knew what was going to take place in the synagogue. We knew that there was a priest. We knew what the Old Testament had to say. Can we just not go back to the things that we know so well? It just seems so easy. The Hebrew writer wants to make a point. If you do that, that comes with a loss. You will lose something in the process. You may be going to what is most comfortable, but you also are going to something that is inferior, that really won't give you what you need. And that's one of the big problems. We trade one thing for another. In life, there's always trade-offs. A lot of times, for the comfort, we'll give up the growth. For heaven, if we want heaven, we have to give up the world. But if we want the world, we usually give up heaven. What the Hebrew writer is basically trying to say. Why would you want to give up the best for the good? And so he says to them that you are going to give up the real thing for nothing more than a copy of it. But let me explain the whole process. This is what the crux of this lesson is about. It is a figure, of speech that is called type and antitype. I know those are fancy words, but I can illustrate it this way. Let's define terms first. A type is a picture or a copy. The antitype is what creates the picture. It is the real thing. It is what creates the image. Now, I don't know whether you remember this or not. I do remember this. I'm old enough to remember typewriters. If you don't remember a typewriter, I don't know what to say to you. You have not lived yet. But I remember I typed so many college papers on a regular typewriter that had an inked ribbon to it that went back and forth through the carriage. And when you would strike a key, it would throw up a metal piece and it would leave the impression of what was on the face of that metal piece onto the paper. What was left on the paper is called type. Why we call it a typewriter? It leaves the type there. But the real thing that made the impression remains in the typewriter. It's the antitype. Now, we have these kind of situations all the time. I have time to time, we get gifts from our grandchildren. Usually they come out of preschool or something like that. One of the things that we have a plaster of Paris plate that has the impression of one of our grandchildren's handprints in them. I know how that was made. The teacher poured plaster of Paris into this form and then had the child mash its hands into the plaster of Paris. And when they did and let it dry, what was left was an impression of their hands. The type is the plaster of Paris hands. The real thing is their hands. What the Hebrew writer wants to say is, why would you trade your grandchildren's hands for nothing more than a plaster of Paris imitation? Makes a different view of that. But there are three things that I'd like to focus on this morning in the book of Hebrews that talks about this copy and what is the real thing. Those three areas are that you find yourself looking at a king that Israel knew and respected and was greatly part of their heritage. You had the concept of the priest, especially the high priest, who was the go-between for the people and God, who offered the sacrifices, who took care of the Day of Atonement. And finally, you have the sacrifice. The sacrifice is that which would handle the sin of life. And for the Jewish people, sacrifices were multiplied. They were constant. And for those three things, he takes those three items, at least in our lesson today, and he says, if you want to know who the real king is, it's not what you had on earth. Jesus is the real king. If you know who the true high priest is, it wasn't Aaron or any of his descendants. It's Jesus himself. And if you want to know what the ultimate sacrifice is, the one that doesn't need to be offered again, Jesus is the real sacrifice. Everything else is nothing more than a copy or a shadow of what reality is. So how does the Hebrew writer prove that? What he does is he takes Christ and he wraps it into the paper wrapping of the Old Testament and says, you can see him elevate out of the pages of the Old Testament. You see it happening. Because he says the Old Testament, it was nothing more than the shadow of the real thing, who is Christ. And so let's look at this idea of type and antitype, of copy and reality. In Hebrews chapter 1, the Hebrew writer starts by saying, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed the heir of all things, through whom he has created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making just purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high, became and having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels has God ever said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." Now, there are a lot of things in that passage. He says, Jesus is the very imprint of God himself, the exact imprint of his nature. But he said, there were some things that happened. He said, he made purification for sins. And after he made purification for sin, then he sits down at the right hand, having become superior to the angels. If if you've gone through the lessons with me, you understand that there are two passages here, especially, that are keystone passages with Hebrews chapter 1. The first is Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit here at my right hand." We had a whole lesson on that passage. But here the Hebrew writer says, you remember what he tells to the king, he sits at my right hand. This is the one, because he is pure, because he's offered purification. Now he sits at the right hand of God. And he says he's superior to all things, even the angels. Because which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Those are the words of Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. You see that he takes these hazy images out of the psalm and he said, you want to know how they apply? The reality is found in Christ himself. He goes on a little later in the first chapter by saying, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." That's a citation out of Psalm 45. Psalm 45 makes reference to the fact that the king on the throne, David, is God's selected and chosen uh, representative. He has a scepter in his hand. He, uh, he hates wickedness, and God anoints him with oil. He makes him the Messiah. That's the term, anointed. He makes him the Messiah, Mashiach, the anointed one, above all of his companions. He is going to be the king. But who is this king? It's apparent what he says. He says, "But you are the same, and your years will have no end. And to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand'?" He goes back to Psalm 2. Who is this king? Who is this anointed? This anointed one is the one who sits at the right hand of God, according to Psalm chapter 110 and verse 1. Who is that? It is the one who's made purification for sins. And that after making purification, he sat down at the right hand of God, the resurrection. There are two things in here that I think are important to notice. Number one, the death of Jesus was a purification from sin. That's what the Hebrew writer says. He is going to be the ultimate sacrifice. We're going to look at that in a moment. But on top of that, after he makes purification for sins, he is glorified. He is sat at the right hand of God through the resurrection. Those are events that no one else in all of human history has replicated. No one has died of the sins of humanity and then 3 days later been raised from the dead, never to die again. Jesus is now the king reigning in heaven. And every other king, every other ruler that you have ever had in Israel pales in importance, because none of them have done what he does. They were nothing more than the copy. He's the real thing. But then he moves on, the concept of priest. He says in Hebrews chapter 5, he said, because of this, he is obligated to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. The description of Hebrews 5 is the time called the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, it was commanded by God that all the people assemble together at the tabernacle, and there the priest would don his robes. He would offer a sacrifice for his own sins and the sins of his family, so he could purify himself before he entered the most holy place with a bowl of blood. He would then take his fingers and he would sprinkle the blood that was sacrificed for the sins of the people over the mercy seat, because that's where God gave mercy. When he was finished, he would leave the most holy place. He would go outside to where there was a goat tied in the courtyard. There, he would pour the rest of the blood on the goat. The gate would be opened. The goat would be turned loose into the wilderness to die, and the sins would go away. And for another year, they would be gone. Then a year later, they did it all again. So the Hebrew writer takes that day as a copy of what is really happening in a different form, in a different place. And he says the high priest does this. He's the one sacrificing for sin. But he says because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only one who is called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." He says, Jesus is a priest like Aaron because Aaron was appointed by God to be high priest. And the only way Jesus does not assume he's a high priest, he is made high priest by God in the same way. The problem, though, in the Hebrew mind, the problem would be he can't be a priest. He's from Judah. He's not from Levi. You have to be a Levite to be a priest. You can't be of any other tribe. After all, it says in Exodus chapter 28, verse 1, then bring near to you Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests. It was through the tribe of Levi, through the lineage of Aaron, that the priest was appointed. It was a very exclusive club. So how can Jesus be priest if he's not from the tribe of Levi? The answer is found in an obscure character in Genesis chapter 14 named Melchizedek. He says in Hebrews 5 and verse 6, you are priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? Melchizedek is this strange personage. We never know where he came from. We never know what happened. He is found in like one or two verses in Genesis 14. Genesis 14, Abraham is forced to gather an army to fight a marauding kingdom who has kidnapped several people of the area, including Lot and his family. And that's something Abraham will not stand for. So he gathers a raiding party. They go off, they bring the hostages back, and when they come back, they are met by two people. They are met by the king of Sodom, which is where most of the people were taken from. But then there is this man named Melchizedek. And it says in Genesis 14, 17 and 18, that, and then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God, the God Most High. That's an interesting little idea. He is two things. He is both a king, he's the king of Salem, a place that would become Jerusalem one day, which I find is fascinating. He's the king of Salem, but he is also a priest of the Lord, of the God Most High. priest and king together. The Hebrew writer says that for this Melchizedek, the king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to Abraham apportioned a tenth of everything. He is first, and by translation of his name, the king of righteousness. That's what Melchizedek means in Hebrew. And then he is also king of Salem, king of peace. That's what Salem means, peace. For he is without father or mother or genealogy. We never know who his father was, and we never know what happened to him after this situation. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. He says, since we don't know what happened to him, his story goes on forever. He says that's what Jesus is like. He is eternal. Where he starts from places beyond time, he will go beyond the time that is ended. He is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. There are three reasons I think this is both important to hear. Number one, we don't know anything about Melchizedek, where he came from or what happened to him. And therefore, his lineage is unimportant. He's not Levite. He's recognized by Abraham as a priest long before Levi is even born, long before the Levitic covenants are put together. But beyond that, he's also both priest and king. So he says, who else is priest and king together? You see, he's now going to close a loop as well, the Hebrew writer is, of something that was said in Psalm 110, verse 4. He's used the very first part, sit at my right hand, make your footstool, your enemies my footstool, chapter 1, to verify that he is the king, exalted by God, anointed by God as Messiah. That's the argument of chapter 1. But then he uses Psalm 110, verse 4, same passage. And he says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He says, did you not see what David said there in Psalm 110? He talks about the Messiah sitting at the right hand of God, but he also talks about the Messiah being a priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's who Jesus is. What you saw as a copy of the Old Testament is reality in the personhood of Jesus Christ. He is both priest and king, just as Melchizedek was. But then he goes on to sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 9 takes up the story again of the Day of Atonement. And he says, but when Christ appeared as high priest, that was the last thing we talked about, of the good things that were to come, then, though the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our consciences from dead works to serve the living God? He said, do you not see the shadow and the person casting it? See, in a shadow, there's always someone behind it casting it. Who's casting the shadow in the Day of Atonement? He says there was this tent, but this tent that Christ enters into is greater and more perfect. He enters the tent of heaven. He enters the tabernacle of heaven. He goes to the mercy seat where God really is, not a gold box in a place. He goes to God himself. And there he takes his own blood he has given on his own, and he offers that for the sins of the people. One time, once for all, never to be done again. And he said, if you think that all that sprinkling of ashes and blood on a goat would take care of 1 year's worth of sins, this will cleanse a man from his conscience forever to serve the living God. It will make a real change. The Hebrew writer argues the Old Testament sacrifices were only a copy of the greater sacrifice of Jesus. One reason it's important to study the sacrificial system in Leviticus, as dull as it can be, it seems, is the only way you understand the ultimate sacrifice is to see the copy of it. But Jesus' sacrifice was not once, but once for all. It didn't happen year after year. It didn't happen this year, and then it could happen next year. He sacrificed once for all. And he could actually take away the sin of the people, not just cover it up for a year. How much more superior is his sacrifice than the previous one? So what do we kind of come together with in this lesson? In Hebrews, the author uses a copy to let us see the real Messiah. There was a king, but those were just the simple kings. They would come and they would go. A new one would be anointed when another one died. But Jesus was not simply a king, he was the king, because his resurrection was the ultimate coronation ceremony. He's not just a priest. In fact, he can't be a priest by the Hebrew standards because he's not of the right tribe, but he is the perfect priest because by virtue of his suffering, he presents God to us and us to God. And he is like Melchizedek, a priest forever, without beginning and without end. And finally, he says he's not a sacrifice that just was made over and over again. He was the perfect sacrifice. But he takes away the sin completely. And the Hebrew writer asks a very simple question. Why would you want to trade the best thing in the world for the lesser? This is what God wants you to do. Why would you want to leave the best things God has given for the lesser things that man lives with? But as we come to the end of this entire series, I want to take just a moment to what have we really learned out of this series? I'll give you my approach and what I've taken from it. This is something I knew already, but it's been reinforced. That is very simple. That is that God had a plan to return man back to fellowship with him. But he presented it in a way that revealed itself slowly so men could understand it and then respond to it. And when you look at all the evidence, starting in Genesis chapter 3, as we've gone through it for the last 12 weeks, there's only one person who fits the pattern that was presented, and that's Jesus himself. And the question that's left is, why would you believe anything else? I appreciate you being with me today. Next week we'll start another series. This time it's going to be on the book of 1 Timothy. about navigating the rapids of a changing church as Paul instructs his protege Timothy. So I hope you'll be with me as we introduce the book and some background material, and we'll begin that series in earnest. But I do appreciate you being with me and taking your time, and I've enjoyed it together as well. So have a great day, and I'll see you next week.